September 16, 1944. Beaugency, France. Major General Botho Elster walks toward the bridge over the Loire River, with nearly 20,000 German soldiers behind him and an American honor guard waiting on the opposite bank. There is no artillery barrage, no tanks are charging, no infantrymen are crawling forward beneath machine gun fire. Instead, an entire German field column is approaching captivity under orders from its own commander. Elster's men still possess rifles, machine guns, pistols, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and hundreds of vehicles, yet they are not preparing to fight the Americans. They are preparing to hand everything over. Major General Robert C. Macon, commander of the U.S. 83rd Infantry Division, waits to receive the surrender on behalf of Lieutenant General William H. Simpson's newly activated 9th Army. Brigadier General Otto P. Wayland of 19 Tactical Air Command is present as well, representing the aircraft that have stalked this column for days. Elster steps forward, gives up his pistol, and accepts the destruction of his command without the climactic battle Hitler's regime expects from every German general. Behind him stretches one of the strangest military processions of the Second World War. Thousands of armed German troops marching peacefully toward American lines, while French resistance fighters, civilians, and Allied aircraft watch every movement. The final capitulation is accomplished without a pitched American assault, but the road to this bridge has been anything but bloodless, and understanding why Elster chooses surrender requires going back to the moment Germany's entire position in France begins to collapse. 2 months earlier, the German armies in France still appear capable of holding much of the country. Then the Western Front tears open. On June 6, 1944, Allied armies land in Normandy. For 7 brutal weeks, German forces contain the beachhead. But on July 25, the Americans launch Operation Cobra west of Saint-Lô. The front ruptures. On August 1st, Lieutenant General George S. Patton activates the U.S. Third Army and pours armor through Avranches. American columns race into Brittany, swing east toward the Seine, and threaten to turn the German position in France into a giant trap. Then, on August 15th, an entirely new Allied army group lands on the Mediterranean coast in Operation Dragoon. General Alexander Patch's U.S. 7th Army and French forces surge north through the Rhône Valley toward Lyon and Dijon. German Army Group G, commanded by General Johannes Blaskowitz, now faces catastrophe. If Patton drives east from northern France, while Patch drives north from Provence, hundreds of thousands of German troops in southern and southwestern France can be cut off from Germany. Hitler's commanders begin pulling units toward the only remaining escape corridors. Some are armored formations, others are battered infantry divisions. But far to the southwest, along the Atlantic coast and near the Spanish frontier, tens of thousands of German personnel belong to naval stations, Luftwaffe installations, administrative headquarters, security formations, supply depots, customs organizations, and occupation units, never designed for a 500-mile fighting retreat. Among the officers ordered to bring these scattered troops east is Botho Elster, and his mission already borders on the impossible. Elster is not commanding an armored corps capable of smashing through roadblocks. His grouping forms around the remnants of German occupation infrastructure from southwestern France, including personnel from the Bay of Biscay region and the area stretching toward the Spanish border. The larger formation associated with him initially numbers roughly 30,000 men, but portions split away during the retreat, and a substantial administrative group under another commander manages to continue farther east. What remains with Elster becomes a vast, cumbersome marching column approaching 20,000 people. Many are not frontline infantrymen. Some are Luftwaffe ground personnel whose aircraft are long gone. Some are sailors stranded hundreds of kilometers from a useful port. Others are clerks, technicians, police, security troops, drivers, communications men, and service personnel. Their transport looks like something from 2 different centuries. Motor cars and trucks share roads with bicycles and horse-drawn carts. Fuel is scarce. Horses require food. Vehicles break down and are abandoned. Men who have spent years in garrison duty suddenly face forced marches beneath Allied air supremacy. Their destination lies to the northeast, toward the shrinking German corridor around Dijon, and ultimately the Belfort Gap, the passage between the Vosges and the Swiss frontier that may still offer a route toward Germany. Every day matters because the Americans approaching from two directions are moving faster than Elster's exhausted column, and the race is becoming one he cannot realistically win. Around August 22 and 23, German elements from the far southwest begin pulling away from areas such as Mont-de-Marsan and Dax. Elster's column turns northeast through a France that is no longer behaving like occupied territory. German authority is disintegrating behind it. Local officials vanish. Railway lines are sabotaged. Bridges become uncertain. Telephone networks fail. The French forces of the interior, strengthened by weapons, intelligence, and the rapid Allied advance, emerge openly along the roads. For 4 years, German occupation troops have controlled movement, imposed curfews, conducted arrests, and punished resistance. Now the balance changes by the hour. A German convoy that enters a village does not know whether civilians are merely watching or whether armed resistance fighters are waiting in barns and tree lines. At night, shots crack from darkness. Small detachments disappear. Road signs are altered. Tires are punctured. Supply vehicles lag behind and become vulnerable. Elster cannot simply scatter his men because dispersion would allow the resistance to destroy isolated groups one by one. Yet keeping nearly 20,000 men together creates another problem. From the air, such a column is impossible to hide. The farther it moves towards central France, the more visible it becomes to Allied reconnaissance aircraft, and soon the sky itself begins closing the road ahead. By early September, the spectacle is enormous. American records describe the withdrawing German formations stretched for more than 30 miles in the region between Poitiers and Châteauroux. Imagine the road from horizon to horizon. Grey uniforms powdered white with dust, horses straining against overloaded wagons, bicycles leaning under packs, trucks coughing on dwindling fuel, staff cars weaving around broken carts, exhausted men sleeping in roadside ditches whenever the column pauses. Then comes the sound every German soldier in France has learned to fear. An engine note high above the road. Another joins it. Silver shapes tip into dives. Fighter bombers fall from the sky. Sunlight flashing across wings. And suddenly the peaceful road explodes into dirt. Splintered wood, burning fuel, terrified horses, and men throwing themselves beneath carts. 19 Tactical Air Command, supporting Patton's Third Army, identifies Elster's marching group as a target. Aircraft of the 36th and 405th Fighter Bomber Groups attack elements of the retreat on September 1st and again on September 7th. Their purpose is not merely to kill men. They are attacking movement itself, vehicles, road junctions, morale, and the belief that escape remains possible. The column survives, but every attack reminds Elster that marching by daylight is dangerous, and standing still only gives the Allies more time to close the trap. The title of Elster's surrender is often simplified into the claim that nearly 20,000 Germans give themselves up without firing a single shot. The final handover to the Americans does occur without the kind of battle that normally precedes the capture of an entire force. But Elster's retreat is not a peaceful excursion. His men are repeatedly harassed by French resistance forces. Allied fighter bombers attack the column. Smaller clashes and casualties occur during the march. What makes the episode extraordinary is that the Americans never have to assemble divisions, conduct an artillery preparation, storm defensive positions, or destroy Elster's force in a conventional battle. By September 1944, the German commander reaches a darker conclusion before such a battle begins. Even if his thousands of men can still pull triggers, they can no longer produce a strategic result worth the lives those bullets will cost. But surrendering nearly 20,000 armed troops is not simply a matter of raising a white flag. The column is still deep in territory filled with armed resistance groups that have their own reasons for revenge. Elster does not trust what will happen if he lays down his weapons before reaching regular Allied troops. The Americans, meanwhile, do not yet possess enough infantry south of the Loire to surround him conventionally. That means the surrender will require something almost absurd: a negotiation in which the supposedly trapped Germans remain armed, while an astonishingly small American force tries to convince them that resistance is useless. The American unit guarding this immense stretch of the Loire is Major General Robert C. Macon's 83rd Infantry Division. The division has already paid heavily for its combat experience. It lands in Normandy in June, fights through the hedgerows, takes part in the drive into Brittany, and becomes deeply involved in the reduction of the fortified region around Saint-Malo. By late August, however, the war is moving east faster than entire divisions can be repositioned. Patton's Third Army is racing toward the German frontier, and the southern flank of that advance stretches for hundreds of miles along the Loire. V Corps cannot place a solid wall of troops everywhere. The 83rd Division is therefore assigned the extraordinary task of policing an enormous river frontage, watching bridges, gathering intelligence, cooperating with French forces, and preventing retreating Germans from striking north into the rear of the American armies. It is a mission built on mobility and bluff as much as manpower. Patrols sometimes operate far beyond their parent formations. One of those patrols belongs to the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 329th Infantry Regiment. Its commander is First Lieutenant Samuel W. McGill. He has only 24 men, but in the first days of September, those 24 Americans are about to become the visible edge of American power to an enemy force nearly 800 times larger. On September 8th, McGill pushes south of the Loire and makes contact through the fluid network of French fighters and local intermediaries operating in the German path. Reports reach him that Elster may be willing to surrender. The idea sounds almost unbelievable. Somewhere beyond McGill's tiny reconnaissance platoon are roughly 20,000 Germans. On paper, if they turn north as a concentrated body, they can brush aside 24 men without slowing down. But numbers on a map no longer tell the whole story. Elster does not know precisely how weak the American screen is. He knows only that American armies are everywhere to the north and east, that fighter bombers can appear overhead with little warning, that French guerrillas surround his route, and that the escape corridor toward Germany is collapsing. McGill understands the psychological advantage. He does not behave like the leader of an isolated patrol terrified of being overrun. He behaves like the representative of an enormous army that already considers the Germans defeated. The Americans begin talking instead of shooting, and the very act of negotiation changes the situation. If Elster opens fire now, he is no longer merely marching toward Germany. He is rejecting a possible route to honorable captivity and accepting responsibility for whatever happens to thousands of exhausted men next. Which is exactly why his next request reveals how desperate he has become. Elster does not initially ask for unconditional humiliation. According to the 83rd Division's own wartime account, he proposes something extraordinary. The Americans should send 2 infantry battalions against his force and stage a token battle. After putting up limited resistance, Elster can surrender and claim that he has been compelled by superior force. The request reveals the strange moral architecture of the Wehrmacht in retreat. Elster understands that continuing toward Germany may be hopeless, but simply surrendering thousands of men without battle could expose him to accusations of cowardice or treason. A staged clash would provide a military excuse. Blood, even unnecessary blood, could purchase the appearance of honor. Macon refuses. He will not sacrifice American soldiers to manufacture a justification for a German general. Nor does the 83rd Division conveniently have 2 spare battalions sitting south of the river, simply to perform theater. The refusal places Elster back in the position he is trying to escape. If he wants a battle, he must begin a real one. If he wants to save his command, he must accept surrender for what it is. The Germans then suggest other face-saving arrangements. including negotiations conducted in ways that might conceal the direct humiliation. But the Americans hold the line. There will be no theatrical combat and no fictional defeat, which means Elster must decide whether military honor is worth thousands of actual graves. The decision becomes even harder because the French resistance is closing around the column. For the FFI, these Germans are not abstract pieces on an operational map. Many French fighters have lost relatives to executions, deportations, torture, hostage shootings, forced labor, and occupation policies. They have spent years hiding weapons and risking death while German troops control their towns. Now the occupiers are retreating through the countryside in exhausted columns, and many resistance groups see no reason to allow them an orderly march into comfortable American captivity. Elster fears that surrendering directly to local forces could expose his men to reprisals or chaotic violence. He therefore insists on capitulating to the regular US Army. That creates a dangerous contradiction. The Germans must travel through territory where French fighters can attack them, but if Elster disarms too early, his column may be defenseless before it reaches the Americans. If he keeps his weapons, however, the spectacle looks outrageous to many French civilians. Thousands of armed Germans are being permitted to march north under an agreement toward a surrender ceremony, while resistance fighters who helped make their position impossible are expected to stand aside. Every kilometer, therefore, carries the possibility that a single ambush, a nervous sentry, or an angry German rear guard could destroy the negotiations and turn the road south of the Loire into a battlefield. On September 10th, the crisis reaches Isudun. Elster and American representatives meet to settle the terms. Major General Macon is involved directly, because the surrender has outgrown anything a reconnaissance lieutenant can promise on his own authority. Above them, the Americans provide a reminder that negotiations are taking place beneath overwhelming Allied air power. A strong formation from the 354th Fighter Bomber Group sweeps over the area. The aircraft are not decorative. According to the official history of the US Army Air Forces, they are prepared to attack if the conference collapses and the correct signal is displayed. Elster can hear the engines overhead while discussing the fate of his command. It is a perfect demonstration of the new balance of power in France. He may possess nearly 20,000 men, but he cannot protect their roads from the sky. He cannot call an equivalent Luftwaffe formation to chase the Americans away. He cannot guarantee fuel. He cannot guarantee food. He cannot guarantee bridges. He cannot even guarantee that the road east will remain open by the time his slowest wagons reach the next town. For a commander trained to think in terms of combat strength, this is the turning point. His column still has weapons, but the system that makes weapons militarily meaningful has collapsed around them. The terms worked out at Isudun are unusual because they acknowledge the reality on both sides. Elster agrees to march his formation north toward the Loire and surrender to the Americans. His force will divide into 3 major columns, moving toward crossing points at Orléans, Beaugency, and Mer. German troops will be permitted to retain their weapons during the approach. Only when they reach the south bank of the Loire will they lay down arms and pass into prisoner of war enclosures. The arrangement is not generosity, it is risk management. The Americans need the Germans to defend themselves if hostile resistance groups attempt to destroy the surrendering column before it arrives, because a renewed German-French battle could scatter thousands of armed men across the countryside. American liaison officers and patrols accompany the movement. Staff officers are exchanged to ensure that both sides understand what is happening. Lieutenant Colonel J.K. French goes with Elster's headquarters, while a German liaison officer, Lieutenant Colonel Schmidt, moves into the American command system associated with Colonel Edwin C. Crabble's 329th Infantry. The surrender has now become a military operation of its own, complete with routes, schedules, communications, prisoner cages, food requirements, traffic control, and the constant danger that somebody who has not heard the agreement will open fire. On September 12, the movement begins. The sight is almost surreal. German soldiers who are technically still under arms march toward an enemy position under American guidance, so that they can surrender several days later. Rifles remain slung over shoulders, machine guns ride on carts, staff cars still carry German officers, horses pull wagons loaded with equipment, baggage, and men too exhausted to walk. The columns cover mile after mile through liberated French towns, whose inhabitants have spent 4 years waiting to see these uniforms disappear. Some civilians stare in silence, others shout. Resistance fighters watch from roadside positions with weapons in their hands. American patrols move among the Germans, drastically outnumbered, but protected by the knowledge that Allied aircraft can strike if the agreement collapses. The 83rd Division even has to think about the horses. Contemporary divisional reporting describes American assistance with hay for roughly 800 animals and food for the moving columns. This is not friendship between enemies. It is the practical mathematics of surrender. Hungry soldiers become unpredictable. Starving horses collapse in roads and block movement. Broken vehicles slow the march. Macon wants nearly 20,000 Germans delivered intact to the river, processed, disarmed, and removed as a military threat. And the strangest logistics operation on the Loire now depends on keeping the defeated enemy moving. For Elster, every day of that march is a test of whether his decision can survive contact with men who do not share it. German military culture in 1944 is increasingly dominated by orders demanding resistance regardless of tactical reality. Hitler has declared fortified places to be held to the last man. Commanders who withdraw without authorization risk investigation. Officers know what happened after the July 20 attempt to kill Hitler. Arrests, executions, public hangings, families punished, and suspicion spreading through the officer corps. Elster is therefore not merely calculating whether he can reach Germany. He is calculating what surrender means personally. If the regime survives long enough to judge him, he could be condemned as a traitor. Yet the men walking behind him expose the opposite moral pressure. Many are exhausted, some are sick, others are support personnel with limited infantry training. Throwing them into a battle against American aircraft, resistance groups, and converging Allied armies might satisfy an abstract order to fight, but it will not reopen the road to Germany. The battlefield question becomes inseparable from a human one. Is a commander's duty to obey until his force is annihilated, or to recognize the moment when obedience ceases to serve any military purpose? Elster chooses the second answer, but the regime he serves will eventually answer very differently. The danger of renewed fighting is real, because French forces have no obligation to feel satisfied with American terms. Resistance units have been instrumental in making the German withdrawal miserable. The official American histories themselves acknowledge that FFI harassment helps undermine Elster's movement and morale. Yet when the surrender is arranged, regular American command takes control of the process. To many French fighters, the Germans appear to receive the privilege of marching under arms through territory where they have been occupiers only weeks earlier. It is easy to imagine how quickly the arrangement can collapse. A German soldier hears a shot and fires back. A resistance unit sees weapons and assumes treachery. An American liaison officer cannot reach headquarters. A truck explodes. Rumor spreads that the surrender has been cancelled. Suddenly, thousands of men disperse into woods and villages, and the bloodless capitulation becomes a sprawling, irregular battle. The American solution is psychological as much as tactical. Keep the Germans moving. Keep the columns organized. Keep aircraft visible. And make it unmistakable that surrender offers survival, while resistance will bring overwhelming force. Elster cooperates because he needs the same outcome. For several days, enemies who have spent years trying to kill one another participate in the fragile choreography of preventing another battle, and the closer the column comes to Beaugency, the more astonishing it becomes that nobody has yet shattered the agreement. Meanwhile, the strategic map destroys whatever argument remains for fighting onward. Patch's 7th Army is driving north from southern France. Patton's 3rd Army is already far to the east. German Army Group G is desperately attempting to assemble a defensible line and preserve formations capable of reaching the Vosges. The broader retreat has become a race for junctions around Dijon, and the Belfort approaches. Units that move quickly and possess vehicles may still escape. Elster's mass cannot. His formation advances at the speed of marching men and horse-drawn wagons. Even if he breaks away from the surrender agreement on September 13th or 14, he still has to force his way northeast through increasingly liberated territory, while Allied aircraft dominate daylight movement. He has no realistic prospect of turning 20,000 miscellaneous personnel into an offensive force capable of punching through regular American formations once they close in. The loss of communications with German screening elements makes the isolation worse. Orders from distant headquarters cannot restore missing fuel or air cover. The column has become strategically orphaned. Its weapons can still kill individuals, perhaps hundreds or thousands of them, but they cannot alter the direction of the campaign. That distinction, the difference between the ability to fight and the ability to accomplish something by fighting, is the central fact behind Elster's surrender. And by mid-September, even he can no longer pretend otherwise. The 83rd Division prepares for a prisoner haul larger than many of its own combat concentrations. On September 13th, the 329th Infantry's records note preparations to receive approximately 20,000 German prisoners. Enclosures must be organized. Routes have to be controlled. Weapons collection points are established near the river. The three German columns continue toward Mer, Orléans, and Beaugency. North of the Loire, American soldiers wait for an enemy they do not have to attack. South of it, Elster's men know exactly what lies ahead. Once the first rifles are stacked, there is no realistic reversal. They will cross as prisoners. Trucks will be confiscated. Horses and wagons will be taken into Allied control. Officers will lose command of their formations. Men who have marched hundreds of miles hoping to reach Germany will instead enter cages and eventually prisoner of war camps. For some, the emotion is relief. For others, it is shame. For committed Nazis, it is betrayal. For exhausted conscripts, it is simply survival. The Americans have their own uncertainty. A force of this size could still create chaos if only a fraction refuses orders. But day after day, the columns remain disciplined, and Elster continues toward the rendezvous he has chosen, until at last, the bridge over the Loire comes into view. On September 16th, Elster's headquarters reaches Beaugency. American regimental records place the decisive movement of the German commander and his staff across the Loire at approximately 1400 hours. A platoon from Company K, 329th Infantry, provides the ceremonial honor guard. Macon waits in command of the American side of the transaction. Wayland attends because air power has been one of the invisible walls surrounding Elster throughout the retreat. There is a strange formality to the scene. The German general approaches in uniform. Salutes are exchanged. Officers stand rigidly while photographers and observers record the moment. Then Elster surrenders his weapon. The gesture is small enough to fit in one hand, but its meaning stretches 30 miles down the roads behind him. One pistol represents thousands of rifles, hundreds of vehicles, wagons, horses, headquarters staffs, and an entire body of German military manpower removed from the war. No American artillery battalion has to flatten a town to achieve it. No infantry regiment has to cross open ground into machine gun fire. No tank battalion has to burn fuel hunting the column through central France. The Americans have defeated Elster through operational encirclement, air power, resistance pressure, intelligence, negotiation, and the German commander's own acceptance of reality. But the surrender is still not complete until every man reaches the river. The procession continues into September 17th. German soldiers reach the south bank, surrender weapons, and cross into captivity. Stacks of rifles grow. Pistols are collected from officers. Vehicles move into Allied hands. Men who only days earlier technically belonged to an armed German command now stand in prisoner columns under American guard. The final numbers differ slightly among contemporary American records, which is itself revealing about the scale and complexity of the event. The official Army Air Force's history records 754 officers, 18,850 enlisted men, and 2 women associated with the surrender, a total of 19,606 people. The 329th Infantry's after-action report gives a final count of 19,556 after the remaining prisoners crossed the Loire. The 83rd Division's wartime newspaper summarizes the event more simply as more than 19,500 Germans. Even the date of the ceremonial climax sometimes appears as September 16 and sometimes September 17, because the staff surrender, public ceremony, and mass processing extend across both days. What does not change is the magnitude. Roughly an entire small field army's worth of personnel disappears from the German order of battle without requiring the Americans to fight a corresponding conventional battle. And one comparison elsewhere in France shows exactly how many lives that decision may have saved. Far to the west, other German commanders are making the opposite choice. At Brest, General Hermann Bernhard Ramke commands a fortress garrison ordered to hold one of Brittany's great Atlantic ports. The Americans surround the city and spend weeks forcing their way through fortified ground. Artillery pounds concrete positions. Infantry fight from village to village and bunker to bunker. Buildings collapse into smoking masonry. German machine guns fire from prepared defenses, while American engineers crawl forward with explosives. By the time resistance at Brest ends on September 19, VA Corps has suffered approximately 9,831 casualties in the Brittany fighting associated with taking the fortified area. The port itself is so thoroughly wrecked that its immediate logistical value is drastically reduced. Elster sees a different battlefield and reaches a different conclusion. He has no fortress worth holding. No essential bridgehead depends on his survival. No German counteroffensive waits for him to delay the enemy for 72 crucial hours. His miscellaneous column cannot protect a strategic objective by dying. The only tangible result of a last stand would be shattered French towns, dead German soldiers, dead resistance fighters, dead Americans, and roads littered with burned wagons and horses. At Beaugency, almost 20,000 men instead enter captivity alive, and that contrast makes Elster's decision far more consequential than the quiet surrender ceremony suggests. The surrender also exposes how thoroughly Germany is losing control of France. Army Group G begins its retreat with tens of thousands of men spread across southern and southwestern regions, and the Allied pursuit strips away manpower faster than German headquarters can reorganize it. American official histories calculate that between September 3 and September 14, the 7th Army captures more than 12,000 additional German troops, while Elster's nearly 20,000 become one of the largest single capitulations of the retreat. When prisoners taken at Toulon and Marseille, isolated coastal garrisons, and other formations are included, more than 130,000 men from Army Group G are captured or cut off during the broader campaign. Over 40% of the force associated with the Army Group at the time of the southern France landings, according to the US Army's post-war accounting. These losses do not end German resistance. Experienced formations escape north and later defend the Vosges, Alsace, and approaches to the Rhine with determination. But men like Elster's clerks, technicians, drivers, security personnel, and Luftwaffe ground troops still represent military labor Germany can no longer replace easily. Every prisoner means one fewer man available to repair a vehicle, guard a bridge, move ammunition, operate communications, or fill an emergency infantry battalion, and the Reich is approaching a manpower crisis from which it will not recover. Air power claims an important share of the victory, and with justification. 19 Tactical Air Command has spent the pursuit working with Patton's Third Army, attacking German road movement, bridges, columns, trains, and concentrations. Against Elster, the effect is operational as much as physical. Fighter bombers do not have to kill 20,000 men to defeat them. They only have to make movement unreliable. A truck convoy destroyed at a junction creates a traffic jam. A strafed horse column blocks a narrow road. One burning fuel vehicle may force dozens behind it to stop. Pilots overhead compel troops to disperse into fields, costing hours that the Allied ground armies used to move farther east. The September 10th appearance of the 354th Fighter Bomber Group above the negotiations at Isudun compresses that entire campaign into one image. Elster is discussing surrender while American aircraft circle overhead, available to punish him if he chooses to resume resistance. Yet air power alone does not explain the result. Bombs do not negotiate capitulation terms. Fighter pilots do not guide 3 German columns towards separate Loire crossings. The surrender occurs because air attack combines with ground pursuit, resistance harassment, intelligence, German logistical collapse, and one commander's willingness to interpret the situation differently from the regime he serves. The French resistance deserves the same qualification. Elster is not defeated solely by a few American patrols confronting 20,000 Germans. The FFI helps turn the countryside itself into hostile terrain. Resistance fighters gather intelligence on German movement, harass detachments, threaten supply routes, and ensure that the retreating column never feels secure. Their pressure helps convince Elster that simply moving through central France is becoming unsustainable. Yet the surrender also creates resentment, because regular American forces receive the formal capitulation. The Germans are allowed to retain arms until reaching the river, precisely because American negotiators fear clashes with French groups. From an operational perspective, the logic is understandable. From the perspective of a resistance fighter who has spent years risking execution under German occupation, the sight of armed German troops receiving American food, marching under negotiated protection, and then ceremonially surrendering to US officers can look infuriating. This tension matters because victory in occupied Europe is not a clean transfer of control from Germans to Americans. It is a collision of armies, governments, resistance movements, personal vendettas, and local memories. Elster's surrender succeeds because the Americans manage that volatile mixture just long enough to move nearly 20,000 armed men across the Loire without restarting the war around them. For First Lieutenant Samuel McGill, the episode becomes one of those moments in military history when rank and numbers seem almost irrelevant compared with nerve. His 24-man reconnaissance platoon cannot physically defeat Elster's force. It cannot surround it. It cannot disarm 20,000 Germans by force. If Elster orders an attack during the first contacts, McGill's patrol is in grave danger. Yet reconnaissance troops are trained to operate in uncertainty, and McGill recognizes that the Germans' psychological position is far weaker than their numerical strength suggests. He acts as the connecting wire between Elster's willingness to surrender and Macon's authority to accept it. The 329th Infantry then transforms that possibility into a controlled operation. The episode demonstrates a principle often obscured by battlefield maps. Armies are defeated not only when their soldiers are killed, but when commanders cease believing that organized resistance can accomplish their mission. By early September 1944, Elster may have 20,000 men, while McGill has 24. But the lieutenant belongs to an army advancing toward Germany, and the general belongs to an army whose roads home are disappearing. The true balance of power therefore runs in exactly the opposite direction from the head count, and both officers understand it before a conventional battle proves it. Elster's decision does not bring admiration from Nazi Germany. Surrender without authorization violates the ideological expectation that commanders fight regardless of circumstances. The regime increasingly treats capitulation as a moral crime rather than a military judgment. On March 7, 1945, with the Third Reich itself only weeks from destruction, a German military court sentences Botho Elster to death in absentia. He is beyond its reach because he is already an Allied prisoner. The sentence demonstrates what he has risked at Beaugency. Had he somehow returned to German-controlled territory after ordering the capitulation, he might have faced arrest and execution rather than a new command. The state demands sacrifice even when the battlefield purpose has vanished. Elster chooses the lives of his men over that demand, and Nazi military justice brands the choice criminal. He survives the regime that condemns him. Germany capitulates in May 1945. Elster remains in Allied captivity after the war and is eventually released, living until 1952. His name never becomes as famous as Rommel, Model, Rundstedt, or Kesselring, but the decision that nearly costs him his life poses a question more difficult than many famous victories. When does obedience stop being duty and become waste? The answer is complicated because Elster is still a German general serving a regime that has occupied France and committed immense crimes across Europe. His surrender does not erase that context, nor does choosing capitulation suddenly transform every soldier in his column into an opponent of Nazism. Some are simply exhausted, some want to survive, some remain committed to the regime, others may feel betrayed by their commander. Military history becomes distorted when one humane decision is allowed to wash away everything surrounding it. What makes Beaugency important is narrower and more precise. At one specific moment, Elster possesses the authority to choose between a futile battle and surrender. He can order thousands of men to fight for a road that no longer leads anywhere, or he can accept personal disgrace and captivity. He chooses captivity. That choice does not make him a saint. It makes him a commander who recognizes that the capacity to kill is not the same as a reason to keep killing. In a war filled with commanders who obey catastrophic orders because disobedience threatens reputation, rank, or life, that distinction is significant, and it explains why Beaugency remains more than an unusual footnote in the liberation of France. By late September, the Allied armies have moved far beyond the Loire. Patton's Third Army is approaching the defences of eastern France. Patch's Seventh Army has linked with forces advancing from Normandy and continues toward the Vosges. The strategic value of the Loire, as an exposed flank, diminishes as the front shifts hundreds of kilometers east. The 83rd Infantry Division receives new missions, and Elster's prisoners disappear into the vast Allied prisoner of war system. What had looked like an enormous threat to the American flank becomes paperwork, transport schedules, interrogation files, and rows of captured men. That transformation is itself the measure of the victory. A force large enough to require days merely to count and process is neutralized at minimal Allied combat cost. The roads are not cratered by a divisional battle. Beaugency is not reduced to rubble for the sake of a last stand. American casualty lists do not suddenly fill with names from an assault that never needed to happen. The surrendered vehicles and equipment become trophies or logistical problems instead of targets. For the Allied command, the episode demonstrates how pursuit can produce results greater than destruction. If an enemy formation is isolated, demoralized, deprived of movement, and convinced that escape is impossible, surrender may eliminate it more efficiently than annihilation. For the Germans, the lesson is darker. The retreat from France reveals the vulnerability of an army when operational mobility collapses. Wehrmacht doctrine has often emphasized movement, concentration, and counterattack. But by the autumn of 1944, German formations increasingly operate beneath hostile skies, with insufficient fuel, damaged railways, overstretched communications, and orders disconnected from battlefield reality. Elster's column embodies every weakness. It has manpower but little strategic mobility, weapons but inadequate protection from air attack, officers but fractured communications, vehicles but insufficient fuel, horses but uncertain fodder, a destination but no secure route to reach it. Once those systems fail, the number of rifles becomes misleading. 20,000 armed men can look formidable on paper while being strategically helpless on the road. The Americans do not need to kill every soldier because they have destroyed the conditions that allow the soldiers to function as an effective military force. By the time Elster reaches Isudun, his most important weapon is no longer a machine gun or artillery piece. It is the authority to stop the march before the column disintegrates violently, and his most important tactical decision is to recognize that the battle has already been lost, without waiting for thousands of bodies to prove it. That is why the phrase, "without firing a single shot," must be understood correctly. Shots have been fired during the retreat. Fighter bombers have attacked. Resistance fighters have harassed German troops. Men have died on the road. What does not occur is the expected final battle between Elster's mass and the American army accepting its surrender. Macon does not have to order artillery onto German assembly areas. McGill's 24 scouts do not have to defend themselves against 20,000 men. The 329th Infantry does not have to fight house by house through Beaugency. Elster never receives the staged engagement he initially seeks to protect his reputation. Instead, both sides accept the reality that a battle would change nothing except the casualty figures. In military terms, this is sometimes harder than fighting. Battle provides familiar roles: attack, defend, obey, survive. Surrender forces a commander to declare that further sacrifice has become meaningless, while every tradition of military honor tells him that endurance is virtuous. Elster crosses that psychological line before crossing the Loire, and once he does, an enormous body of German troops stops being an enemy force, not because its weapons disappear, but because its commander orders those weapons not to decide the outcome. The scene at Beaugency therefore stands in sharp contrast to the mythology of the Second World War. The most famous moments are explosions: Omaha Beach under machine gun fire, tanks burning at Kursk, paratroopers descending into Normandy, artillery pulverizing Monte Cassino, cities collapsing beneath bombs. Elster's surrender produces almost none of that imagery. Its drama is restraint. Thousands of men approach with weapons and do not use them. Americans who could call fighter bombers do not call them down. French fighters who have every reason to hate the retreating occupiers are prevented, sometimes uneasily, from turning the surrender route into a revenge battle. Staff officers use maps and schedules instead of fire plans. Trucks carry food rather than ammunition to keep the procession moving. A general hands over a pistol instead of ordering a final attack. Yet the result is militarily enormous. Roughly 19,500 to 19,600 German personnel are removed from the campaign in a matter of days. The absence of a spectacular battle makes the achievement easier to overlook, but it is exactly that absence that gives the event its meaning. For Macon, Wayland, McGill, and the 83rd Infantry Division, the surrender becomes proof that combat power includes more than the men directly holding rifles. Air superiority makes the German road dangerous. Resistance intelligence reveals movement. Reconnaissance discovers willingness to negotiate. Command authority turns informal contact into binding terms. Logistics keeps the surrendering force moving. Psychological dominance persuades a German general that violating the agreement will bring destruction. None of those elements alone captures 20,000 men. Together they make fighting unnecessary. Modern military doctrine would recognize the pattern immediately. Isolate the force, deny mobility, dominate information, threaten overwhelming fires, create a controlled exit, and give the opponent a rational reason to choose it. In September 1944, the terminology is different, but the mechanism is already visible on the roads to the Loire. The Germans are not physically surrounded by an unbroken ring of American infantry. They are surrounded by consequences. Every road east leads towards stronger Allied formations. Every delay increases air attack and resistance pressure. Every attempted breakout risks fragmentation. Surrender becomes the only option that reliably preserves the men under Elster's command. And the Americans are intelligent enough to leave that option open. The broader war continues for almost 8 more months in Europe. German soldiers fight ferociously in the Hürtgen forest. Hitler launches the Ardennes offensive in December. Soviet armies drive through Poland and into Germany. Cities burn. Teenagers and old men are pulled into the Volkssturm. Commanders order bridges defended after they have lost strategic value, and towns held after escape routes disappear. Hundreds of thousands more soldiers and civilians die between Elster's surrender and Germany's final capitulation in May 1945. Against that background, the Loire episode becomes almost prophetic. Elster recognizes in September what Germany's leadership refuses to recognize until the ruins reach Berlin. Military courage cannot transform an impossible strategic position into a possible one. There is a point at which continued resistance does not postpone defeat in any meaningful way. It merely increases the number of people who will not survive to see it. At Beaugency, one German commander reaches that point, while he still has nearly 20,000 men available to sacrifice, and instead of sacrificing them, he accepts disgrace, captivity, and eventually a death sentence from his own government. The surviving records leave small contradictions. A ceremony dated the 16th in one account and the 17th in another, a final prisoner total varying by several dozen, but those discrepancies do not weaken the story. They make the scale more tangible. For 2 days, the surrender is not a single photograph, but a moving operation stretching across multiple Loire crossings. Elster's headquarters passes into American hands while thousands of men are still marching. Prisoners continue arriving. Weapons continue piling up. Clerks continue counting. The 329th Infantry eventually records 19,556 people processed. The Army Air Force's history records 19,606 in its accounting. What matters is that almost 20,000 human beings, who might have become casualties, are instead counted as prisoners. Historians can debate how much credit belongs to air power, the resistance, American ground forces, collapsing German strategy, or Elster himself. But the answer is necessarily all of them. Without Allied encirclement, he may keep marching. Without air attack, the road may remain usable. Without resistance pressure, the column may move faster. Without McGill, contact may fail. Without Macon, negotiations may not mature. And without Elster's final decision, all those pressures may still end in bloodshed. Years later, the great operational arrows of 1944 make the episode seem inevitable. The Allies are advancing. Germany is retreating. A trapped column surrenders. But nothing feels inevitable to the people standing inside events. On September 8th, McGill does not know for certain that Elster will honor negotiations. On September 10th, Macon does not know that the German general will accept terms without demanding his theatrical battle. During the march north, nobody can guarantee that the resistance will remain restrained or that a German unit will not mutiny against the surrender order. On September 16th, even as Elster approaches the bridge, thousands of armed Germans remain south of the Loire. History remembers the peaceful outcome and forgets how many opportunities exist for the agreement to collapse. That uncertainty is what gives the surrender its tension. Peace on a battlefield is never automatic. It has to be chosen repeatedly by armed people who remain capable of violence. Elster chooses it when he signs away his command. Macon chooses it when he refuses needless combat, but permits a controlled withdrawal to the surrender points. American patrols choose it as they guide armed Germans. The men in the columns choose it each time they continue toward the river, instead of turning their rifles outward. In the end, Botho Elster does not surrender because his soldiers are incapable of firing. He surrenders because firing can no longer achieve the mission for which soldiers are supposed to fight. His route to Germany is collapsing. His column is slow, heterogeneous, exhausted, short of the mobility needed to outrun Allied armies, vulnerable to fighter bombers by day and resistance attacks along the roads. The Americans controlling the Loire are stronger than their visible patrols suggest, because behind those patrols stands the industrial, aerial, and operational weight of the Allied advance. Elster understands that a last battle may satisfy Nazi expectations of obedience, but it will not restore a front, reopen Dijon, defeat Patton, stop Patch, or save Army Group G. It will simply exchange thousands of living prisoners for thousands of dead and wounded men. So he performs the act that authoritarian military systems fear most from experienced commanders. He substitutes judgment for obedience. The Nazi state later condemns him for it, but the 20,000 men who cross the Loire alive become the evidence of what that judgment prevents. At Beaugency, Botho Elster proves that in a war built on obedience, the hardest order a commander may ever give is the one that tells thousands of men to stop dying for a battle already lost.